So, good morning, everyone. I am excited to be a part of the introduction of a five-part series that we're looking at as a task force team. My name is Lawrence Garrett again. I am the co-lead of the organizational structures team. And let me just fix my screen here. There we go. So, I'm the co-lead of the organizational structures team. And we are excited about unrolling or kind of laying out a DEI leadership and management plan for the entire Pierce County network. And so today's opportunity and today's presentation is really about two things. One, how do we have a conversation about even introducing DEI work into our organization, A, and then two, what are we looking for? What is the scope, right, of the things that we're going to be looking for? And so I'm going to cover the scope, and I'm going to cover how do we have a conversation to even get the ball rolling. So I always think it's always good to start with a quote from Grandma. And so Grandma says, you have two ears and one mouth. You need to do double the listening and half the talking. And one of the things that I found very effective in DEI leadership and management is that questions are more important than answers. And so oftentimes we find ourselves in positions where we may have taken courses, we have been through training. And so we're just quick to want to give lots of information and pound people with information, which is great. But what I will tell you, what is most effective in making this systemic and sustainable in regards to DEI practices is being really good at listening. And when I say listening, I mean being quick to hear and slow to speak. And so I had to throw Grandma out there in regards to understanding why this is effective in the approach of DEI leadership and management. And so now let's talk about what that looks like. So in regards to scope, there's three things we want to pay attention to. What is the buy-in? What is the bandwidth? And what is the budget? When you're looking at these three things, we have to start with buy-in. And again, you're going to find that I'm a quote person. So you're going to see lots of quotes coming from me. It's kind of the thing that I breathe. And so in this aspect of buy-in, when the purpose of a thing is unknown, abuse is inevitable. In other words, when we're not really clear on what and why and how we're planning to do this, then guess what? The results become shaky, it becomes confusing, and it actually does more harm than help. And I don't think it's just a principle that applies to DEI work and management. I think this applies to life in general, right? And any aspects, when you think about what is the purpose of family, what is the purpose of money, what's the purpose of anything, if we're not really clear on what it is, abuse is inevitable. And I know for some, abuse may sound like a harsh word, but when you really break it down, abuse is just abnormal use, right? So it's just that this is not being used in a way that is intended. Why am I bringing that up? Because clearly, after George Floyd and the growing racial unrest that has been happening in our country, we are finding more and more organizations that are abusing the concept of anti-racism work, that are abusing DEI management work. They're putting out statements, right? They're saying, you know, all these things, but are they really doing the work in their board? Are they really doing this work in their staff? Are they really doing this with their vendor partners in their constituency? And so when we can get them to recognize that it's not just about external statements and kind of external facing things, this is also needs to match what's happening on the inside and the internal practices of the things that we're doing. Because if we're not doing that, then really this is just a form of bait and switch, or some people will refer to it as performative allyship and all that other stuff that kind of plays out in what's happening. So let's kind of go into buy-in. So the first question is who? Who are the key decision makers here, right? And it's not, and there's two types of decision makers. So it's not just the decision makers of people who are going to push the button, write the check, right, and move things forward. It's really who are the key influencers in the organization that influence the decision makers. And so that means we need to take a pulse of all the different positions and stakeholders that are within the organization and get their pulse on what they see that needs to get done in regards to DEI work. The next question is the what, right? What do they see as the problem and how do they perceive improvement? And when I say they, I'm talking about everyone. And the reason why I bring this up is going back to the first slide is we need to understand how people perceive the situation, not just how I perceive it, not just how, you know, some expert who flies in sees the situation. We need to be really clear on how others perceive, not just the problem, but how do they perceive what they think the solution is. I've got a good thought partner, friend, and colleague. Her name is Sharice Campbell. She said it best. She said, in order for us to want to change policy, we have to change practice. But in order for us to change practice, we have to change mindsets. And if we're not changing mindsets, there is no point of putting in practice in place and no point of putting in policy in place. And I know many of you guys are probably have really, really strong kind of equity practices and policies that have been put in place. And yet somehow we're still struggling with the same issues because the truth is the mindsets haven't changed. So until we can get to a point which moves to point number 3, which is the why, right? Why are we doing this work, right? And it can be rooted in 2 things is what I found. Is it rooted in fear or is it rooted in hope for a better tomorrow and better changes and a better organization? What that is very important for us to acknowledge, because there are some organizations right now that are finding themselves is that they don't want to be seen as the racist organization, right? They don't want to be seen as the one who's being left behind. And so the impetus of them wanting to move forward is not rooted in faith or hope or inspiration or innovation or any of those things. It is actually rooted in fear, which becomes counterproductive and it ends up bringing a culture of compliancy, right? Or complacency, right? Compliance and complacency. And that is not what we're looking for Buyin. So we have to be absolutely clear on what is the purpose. Why are we doing this work? Next is bandwidth. Who's ever heard this statement before? Racism is the air we breathe, right? I imagine many of you have heard that statement before. And the reason why I'm centering this on racism is because we can't address any kind of equity until we address racial equity, right? And so the three things that we need to kind of acknowledge, right, when we talk about racism being in the air, that is systemic and all these things, like how it infects all the different aspects of industries and different sectors, it's 3 things, right? 1, it's invisible, and I'm talking about air, right? In other words, oftentimes it's really hard to see, but you can definitely see the impacts and the outcomes of it, right? So that's 1, right? Number 2, it's pervasive and it's permeating every aspect of sectors and companies and industries across the United States, right? But here's the most kind of significant thing that we need to be mindful of. We're dependent on it. And this is the part we gotta help people recognize. And when I say we're dependent on racism, when we think of the very fabric of how our economic engine runs in America, it is capitalism rooted in a racial caste system. What do I mean by that? Is that anytime we're looking at value of anything, you can find, when I say value, meaning the value of goodness, the values of services, it's typically going to be rooted in whiteness, right? What is considered a good school? What is considered a good neighborhood? What is considered a good restaurant? What is, and what I'm making the point to say is that our North Star of how we even evaluate things, it is rooted in racist ideology. And so why am I going there? Is because when you look at the emotional, mental, and physical components of what's necessary, right, to actually dismantle systems of oppression, we have to let people know that this is not going to be a quick fix type deal, right? And this is the reason why I'm bringing it up, because oftentimes we find ourselves or people are in positions of influence and power. They're like, well, why don't we just bring a trainer in and he can just, or he or she can just tell us, how this can work and we can get it fixed. That's not going to work, right? Because we're not giving it the proper due of what's needed for the changes to actually be made. So let's talk about that, right? So we have to let people know this work is going to be messy. It's going to be messy. People are going to be emotionally all over the place. And you know what? That's a sign of good things actually happening in your organization. When we decide to deny, be dismissive, or minimize what is actually happening here, we're only prolonging the process and it's actually creating more pain. One of the things, and I'm going to kind of hit on it in the physical piece, but the reason why I say we need to address it from the standpoint is that we are almost kind of addicted to it, is because we have to look at it as a form of addiction. When people have been drug impacted, right? One of the things we've all kind of acknowledged and noticed is that the first component of it is denial, right? Like we're going to just deny that it doesn't exist, right? But the truth of the matter is we know that it is, and the sickness is impacting everyone around us, right? So when you hear people talking about systemic racism doesn't exist, that's a myth and a thing like that, guess what? They're in denial. right? This is part of being racist impacted, drug impacted, right? In regards to what are the necessary kind of like categories, if you will, and continuum of learning and growth and development necessary for someone to move out of that denial and dismissive phase. Number two is the mental component of this, right? People have to recognize this, that there's no, oftentimes we have to accept non-closure, right? We have to accept that sometimes things aren't going to end with a bow on it at the end of a training or after an end of a meeting or after an end of a discussion. And it's interesting because it's kind of part of the Eurocentric custom of how Americanism works to some degree. And I want you to know I'm a proud patriot. So I'm saying it because I love America. And I'm glad this is on recorded, because I want to make sure that I love it so I can criticize it, right? Just like my wife loves to criticize me because she loves me, right? And so I could take that, right? And so here's the deal. The thing about it is that when we even look at our culture and our movies, right? Our movies are designed in a way that is always a happy ending, right? The good guys always win, right? But when you look at foreign films, right? It's not always a happy ending. It's not always going to end well. And so that's some of the things that we have to kind of detoxify ourselves, right? Out of, is saying that sometimes at the end of a meeting, at the end of a presentation, at the end of a discussion, that it's not going to be a bow, right? It's not going to land well, right? It's going to be something that we're going to have to process, and we're going to have to get comfortable being uncomfortable in this journey. The last thing is in the physical piece about this, when we start to really start digging deep into this work, we have to increase our self-care practices and routines. Because trust me, I've watched people not sleep well. I've watched people, eating habits start to change. I've watched people, become more angst. And there's a number of components, because this is triggering, right? When I talk about this is actually an experience of going through detox, this is a very much experience of going through detox. Another example I like to use is if anybody's familiar with the movie The Matrix, right? There was a point in time before Morpheus gave Neo the red pill option or the blue pill option, he explained how the Matrix actually works. If you get an opportunity, and if I actually had more time today, I would have actually played that video for you, because when you listen to how that was explained, that's very much of how systemic racism plays out in our culture today. And so we need to prepare our team and our audience, not just for buy-in, but do they have the bandwidth? Are they aware of what the bandwidth of what it's going to take to do this well? And then the last thing is the budget, right? And so people need to be aware that this is going to cost, right? If we're going to do this well, there's a self-starter approach, which the task force is going to be presenting, but if there needs to be considerable amount of investment to seeing this work, because we're not talking about just changing policy. We're talking about transforming people's lives, changing people's mindset on how they're even looking at life, more or less than looking at work. And so we need to know, what is the percentage of their current budget that actually goes to training? Fascinating enough, some folks don't even have an actual percentage of what they're looking at as far as what is their current training budget. But then within that budget, we need to determine how much of this is going to actual DEI work. The next one is finding out who is determining the type of trainer and training and timing involved. And this goes back to one of the earlier slides when I talked about the stakeholders, who are all involved in decision making of who's going to be approved. Here's one of the things that I say, and I know this is on record, and I'm okay with this. My opinion is that it is African-American women, in my opinion, are the realest DEI practitioners out here doing the work. And if they're not calling you an ally, I'm not calling you an ally, because you can't just self-proclaim and call yourself an ally unless somebody's going to co-sign on that, right? And so one of the things we need to be mindful of is that when we're looking at trainers in training, who is co-signing on this, right? And so the last thing is the financial commitment and obligation to expand the work going forward, because this is not just a one-time deal. And for any of the other practitioners out there, let's continue to voice that this is not a one-time deal. This is not just let's do the DEI for the year. No, this needs to be embedded in monthly meetings, monthly trainings, because again, this is transformative work. And the last thing that I want to do as far as closing thoughts is I got an opportunity to be part of the Courageous Conversation training done by the Pacific Education Group. And I'll tell you, the thing that really struck me about that training was that the trainer had said that this is not just about what we think and what we need to do. This impacts the way we think, the way we feel, what we believe, and what we do. In other words, it's all encompassing, right? It's not just a matter of the cerebral understanding of things. And so I want to take a moment, and this is where, you know, Shelley says, if you got to ask, right? And here's my ask for everyone today. I want everyone to take a moment, and you can close your eyes, or you don't have to close your eyes. And I want you to think about why this work is so important. There's literally lives that have been lost because this work is not penetrating people's hearts, because there's policies that have not been in place, because there's accountability that has been missing. So I want us to just take a moment and think about George Floyd, and think about Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Stewart and the countless others. That's just the lives being lost. But then there's livelihoods that have been lost. People that you have worked with, people that are in your family, people that you are connected to, that we have these conversations all the time. This is not new news to anyone in regards to the impacts of oppressive systems and how they have continued to marginalize people. Let's give them this moment. Your hope in seeing change has to be greater than your fear of doing this wrong. I'm done. Thank you.